Hello again. Welcome to session 3 of our series, Half Truths by Adam Hamilton. I'm Chuck Williams. Down here is our buddy Bo. There he is. And today we're going to take a look at a new phrase in our third session. And that phrase is, God won't give you more than you can handle. I want to start today's discussion with an excerpt from the book. That excerpt is as follows. I know you are going through a tough time right now. You feel like you're sinking. The burden is too heavy. You don't know how much more you can bear, but it's going to be all right. You're going to make it through. Remember, God never gives us more than we can handle. For a lot of you, that probably sounds familiar. I think each of us has probably heard that in some form in our lifetimes. Might have come from a friend, it might have come from a family member, might have even come from a pastor. In fact, you may have even said it yourself a time or two. But our question today is it true? Now, to answer that question, we need to consider that saying and see if we can find its spiritual basis. Now, generally speaking, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, that's generally cited to be the source for the idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read that passage. But then what we're going to do is we're going to read in just a little more deeply. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 10, 13, which says the following. No temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation, he will also provide a way out so that you may be able to bear it. So you can see when they're talking about no temptation has come upon you except what is common, it can be easily defined as God will never give you more than you can handle. Thus, the belief that this is where the saying was born. But let's take a look a little bit deeper into what Paul was actually saying to the Corinthians by going back and starting at 1 Corinthians 10, verse 8. Let us not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. And in a single day, 23,000 people died. Let us not test Christ as some of them did and were destroyed by snakes. And don't complain as some of them did and were killed by the destroyer. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our instruction, on whom the ends of the ages have come. So whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall. No temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation, he will also provide a way out so that you may be able to bear it. And then if we go one more verse into verse 14, he says, so then, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. So as we can see, what Paul was actually talking to the Corinthians about was their practices of idolatry and immorality. Paul was trying to help the Corinthians in their establishment of a new church. The Corinthians were a community that were certainly throughout Roman times known for their paganism. They were quite used to doing idol worship. They were quite used to sexual immorality. They were quite used to having prostitutes within the temples. This was a normal way of life for the Corinthian people. Change from that to the good word of Jesus was proving to be difficult for some. They were tempted to either return to their pagan practices or to try to combine their practices with their newfound worship of Jesus. Now, Paul was trying to explain to them that this is certainly tempting, but this was not at all what God sought from them. So in his explanation from 8 through 14, he let them know that as tempting as pagan rituals might be for them, God had provided a way to move past the temptation of idolatry and past the temptations of immorality, and to be able to seek the true Christ. Now, over the course of time, what Paul said to the Corinthians kind of morphed into the saying that we know today. God never gives us more than we can handle. But what we've kind of done is we've kind of adopted it to a today thing, as if to tell folks, chin up, carry on. God never gives us more than we can handle. What he was actually trying to explain to the Corinthians was, stay the course. Worship Jesus with all of your might. Turn from your old ways. God never gives you temptations that he does not allow you escapes from. So when we take that passage in its intended sense, we see where the reminder can be helpful to us, but we all have temptation. Every year around this time, a lot of people are in the middle of fulfilling their New Year's resolutions. We're going to do more exercise. We're going to have a better diet. We're going to have less stress. We're going to have less drinking. And we're going to have less chocolate. That's the problem with temptation. It's a hard thing. Chocolate's pretty delicious after all. Exercise, that can leave you kind of sore. You might need a few days off to recover from that. You know, I should have less stress in my life, but if I don't solve this problem, who will? And I know I need to drink a little less, but I had a lot of stress at work today. Then I had that double cheeseburger for lunch, and I kind of feel bad about that. And it was raining, so I didn't get my walk in, so I got no exercise. I could really use that drink to unwind. 30 days later, resolution's over with. Better luck next year. But see, God really does give us the tools that we need to overcome our temptations. The first and perhaps most important of these is that God is not the one in charge of our temptations. That comes from us. It's a wholly human condition, and one that we seldom acknowledge. When we begin to understand that God is not setting roadblocks up to prevent us from self-improvement, we begin to understand temptation for what it is. Temptation is like a highway, and God truly did provide many off-ramps before we reach the end of that road. It's just our responsibility to take one. So when we understand that Paul was more talking about temptation that the Corinthians were encountering, we can take a different look at the saying that most people have always believed came directly from the Bible. We use this sentence again, and we use the statement again, God never gives you more than you can handle. And I think that the first 4 words of that saying are the most important words. God never gives you more than you can handle. The first 4 words being, God never gives you. One of the hardest things that people have to reconcile is God's role in a tragedy. Tornado strikes, hurricane, people lose everything, sometimes up to and including their lives. It can become very difficult during those periods of time to separate tragedy from God. Why couldn't God have prevented this? Doesn't he understand that losing my home and my possessions and maybe even a family member was clearly more than I was going to be able to handle? You could ask yourself, how am I supposed to handle this better? The truth of the matter is that tragedy is probably not the best time for self-critique. So all too often we find that when bad things truly do happen, our default is usually to A, question why did God allow this to happen? Or sometimes we have B, if God never gives us more than we can handle, why were we so unable to handle this current tragedy? Is the failure in us? And a lot of people, when they actually experience tragedy, they suffer that question. And they suffer both of those questions in differing times over and over and over again. And it's a very, very vicious cycle. Maybe, though, maybe the truth is something that's entirely different. Maybe when the worst day of your life happens, maybe God didn't give that to you. Maybe it was just part of the human condition. Maybe it was just an accident with no serious rhyme or reason to it. Maybe it just was. For a lot of folks, the concept of maybe is so difficult in times of tragedy that it's almost incomprehensible. Because a lot of folks struggle with, I've suffered this tremendous loss, and if I can't make sense of it, then I don't know where to go, and I don't know what to do. When you've encountered great loss, one of the most difficult things that there is to do is to reconcile it so that it makes sense in your world. And I do not, and I highly recommend that no one do, attempt to tell people how to process their loss or attempt to tell people how to process their grief from their loss. Everybody's condition is unique. I'm also a lot more careful now about telling people that I don't tell people God never gives you more than you can handle, because I think that the truth is sometimes you get a whole lot more than you can handle. And sometimes you get so much that you can't handle it at all. I think we simply need to look at the first four words of that and say, perhaps it was not God that gave that to us to begin with. Perhaps it was just part of the imperfection of our human condition. So, what's God's part in the saying then? I think on the surface, I think that the saying is got a lot of truth to it. Life is going to throw things at you that are going to be particularly hard to handle. I just don't always think that that was God's doing. Sometimes, again, things just are. And sometimes we're all going to feel like we can't cope. We can't cope with the loss. Can't possibly cope with the pain. Can't cope with the sadness. And we think to ourselves, Lord, you've given me more than I can handle. And we think to ourselves, why? I've long believed that none of us out there are very, very good at handling tragedy our first time around. Whether it be loss of a loved one, loss of a family member, natural disaster, devastating news on a job front, scandal, anything that completely upsets the foundation, I don't believe that any of us are very good at handling tragedy the first time around. Why is that? More than anything else, because we haven't had any practice at it yet. We have not endured a tragedy. We have not We have not walked through fire. We have not walked through all of those things. And as a result, the first time that it happens, I don't think we tend to be very good at it. So maybe in that context, maybe God's part in the whole equation of God never gives you more than you can handle, maybe God's part is not that God gave you this thing that you can't handle. Maybe God's part is the part of that someone that you can rely on to make sure that when you're going through your first tragedy or your fifth tragedy, that you're not going through it alone. Maybe God's part in loss and tragedy and more than you can handle, maybe God's part is to be there to lean into. Maybe God's part is to be the steady influence that during times of tragedy, during times of loss, that steady influence that has to be there when the silence can become deafening. Maybe God's part in all of it is to be that one thing that you've got left to hold on to at that particular moment when no other answers are coming and nothing else makes sense. Maybe that's God's part, and God never gives you more than you can handle. Maybe it's more, you'll get more than you can handle, but because of God, you might get through. So, our thought for today is this. The next time that you think to say, don't worry, God never gives you more than you can handle, take a pause. Maybe instead, try something like, I just want you to know I'm here for you as you go through this. That is God's grace. Amen. So thanks for taking the time with Bo and I today. We enjoyed your company, and we'll see you at the next installment. Bye.